A boring but true history of crime and punishment in medieval Europe. Introduction. Welcome to the dungeon. If you've ever dreamed of living in the past, this may cure you. In this unusually long, admittedly boring, but painfully accurate tour through crime and punishment in medieval Europe, we won't be chasing knights or listening to grand speeches from kings. Instead, we'll be dragging our feet through the muddy streets of a stinking medieval town, avoiding pickpockets, public hangings, and the occasional rat-infested jail. This is not a story of glorious conquests or shiny armor. This is the history of the people who got caught. The petty thieves, the loud drunks, the bakers who cheated customers by using bad grain. It's about crimes so small we'd barely notice them today, and punishments so brutal they'd make a modern audience queasy. Our journey will take us through village courts and royal tribunals, dungeons and scaffolds. We'll meet corrupt sheriffs, bumbling watchmen, terrified peasants, and the very unlucky souls who found themselves at the wrong end of the law. And we'll do it all in a tone calm enough to lull you to sleep, assuming the details of hot tongs and stocks don't wake you right back up. Get comfortable. Light a candle. Maybe lock your door. You're about to hear just how bad it was to get caught stealing a chicken in 1297. The legal definition of crime in the medieval period was remarkably flexible. It depended on where you lived, who ruled over you, and sometimes who you offended. There were no standardized penal codes like today. Instead, crimes were defined by custom, religious teaching, and local tradition. It wasn't just theft or murder. Cursing, working on a Sunday, refusing to kneel at Mass, or gossiping too loudly could get you into serious trouble. Crimes against the church, heresy, blasphemy, missing Mass, witchcraft, eventually, or simply disagreeing too loudly with a priest. These were often punished with spiritual penalties, but not always. A heretic could end up at the stake. Crimes against the crown, treason, rebellion, counterfeiting coins, and sometimes poaching royal deer. These were serious and often carried the death penalty, or worse, mutilation. Crimes against your neighbors, theft, assault, murder, adultery, slander, and general bad behavior. These were the most common. Some acts were considered sins and therefore crimes. Others were treated more like disruptions to social harmony. For example, a woman shouting at her husband in public might be punished for disturbing the peace. A man refusing to pay a debt might be put in the stocks. In one case, a pig was put on trial for eating a child. Really? And yes, animals could be criminals. Sometimes even executed. But we'll get to that. Next, we'll look at how justice was enforced in places where literacy was rare, superstition ruled, and trials didn't always require evidence. Medieval law enforcement was, in a word, inconsistent. In another word, local. There was no national police force, no central authority issuing badges or uniforms. Instead, justice was maintained by an odd patchwork of officials, volunteers, and people who just liked knowing everyone's business. In towns, a watchman might be employed to patrol the streets at night, calling out the hour and watching for fires or troublemakers. These men weren't exactly professionals. Often, the job was given to older men, or those who weren't fit for physical labor. In some places, the role rotated among citizens as a civic duty, whether they wanted it or not. The day-to-day enforcer of the law was usually the constable, a locally appointed official tasked with keeping the peace. The constable could arrest people, organize a posse, or drag a suspect before a local court. But their powers varied widely depending on the region and century. In the countryside, things were even more informal. Law and order often relied on what was called tithing, a group of 10 men who were collectively responsible for each other's behavior. If one committed a crime, the others were expected to produce him or face punishment themselves. It was a crude form of communal policing, and then there were the manorial courts, overseen by the local lord or his steward. Villagers would gather periodically to settle minor disputes and deal with small offenses. Gossiping, petty theft, livestock straying into someone else's field, all might be punished with a fine or a few hours in the stocks. Perhaps the most underrated force in medieval law enforcement was the village itself. Reputation mattered. And the village gossips, who always knew who was sleeping with whom, who owed what, and who was stealing bread, could make or break someone's life. Social pressure could be as punishing as any legal penalty. In many ways, the enforcement of law was more about managing order than punishing wrongdoing. Justice was often arbitrary, depending on the mood of the lord, the testimony of neighbors, or the size of the bribe. But once someone was accused, what came next? Trials of a sort. Medieval justice was not blind. In fact, it was often based on the assumption that guilt or innocence could be revealed not by evidence, but by divine will, or a well-aimed rock. Trials in the Middle Ages were rarely what we'd recognize today. There were no lawyers, no jury of peers, and definitely no presumption of innocence. What they had instead were ordeals, oaths, and a whole lot of superstition. The most infamous were the trials by ordeal, a set of physical tests designed to let God decide the outcome. If you were innocent, it was believed he would protect you. If you were guilty, well, best of luck. Take the ordeal by fire. The accused might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for several paces or plunge their hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Afterward, the wound would be bandaged and left alone for a few days. Then a priest would inspect it. If it was healing cleanly, God had spoken, innocent. If it was festering, guilty. There was also the ordeal by water, which reversed our expectations. A person was bound and thrown into a river. If they floated, it meant the pure water rejected them, guilty. If they sank, the water had accepted them, innocent. Unfortunately, many who proved their innocence drowned before they could be pulled out. In time, these ordeals were condemned by the Church. By the 13th century, they were being phased out in favor of something equally unreliable, compurgation. This involved the accused swearing an oath of innocence, backed up by a group of people, often neighbors, who swore they believed the accused was telling the truth. These oath helpers didn't have to know anything about the crime. They just had to be willing to publicly vouch for someone's honesty. For more serious offenses, especially those involving property disputes or violence, cases might go to a royal court. But that didn't guarantee fairness. Wealth and social status often mattered more than truth. The poor were vulnerable to false accusations, nobles were hard to convict. The outcome of a trial might hinge on bribes, threats, or political alliances. Sometimes, the evidence was the crime itself. If a man was found standing over a dead body with a bloody knife, that might be enough. But without modern forensics, proving anything conclusively was nearly impossible. And then there was the trial by battle, still practiced in some places well into the late medieval period. Two parties would literally fight it out, believing God would grant victory to the righteous. It was not uncommon for older or weaker men to hire champions to fight on their behalf, essentially medieval lawyers with swords. For accused women, especially those charged with witchcraft or adultery, the situation was worse. They could be forced to undergo humiliating ordeals or subjected to intense interrogation, not to uncover the truth, but to extract confessions, often through coercion or torture. The reality was that trials were less about facts and more about appearances, social pressure, and luck. If you had allies, a good reputation, or some coin, your chances improved. If not, well, the stocks are weighted. Next, we'll explore what happened to the unfortunate souls who failed these trials and received their punishment. If you think the Middle Ages were all about beheadings and torture chambers, you're partially right. But the vast majority of punishments handed down to medieval criminals weren't about death, they were about deterrence. And nothing deterred quite like public humiliation and pain. Let's start with the stocks. These wooden devices locked a person's ankles, wrists, or neck in place, immobilizing them in a seated or standing position. They were usually placed in the middle of a village square, so everyone could see the offender and offer their thoughts, which often came in the form of rotten vegetables, stones, or just a good old-fashioned spit. People might be left in the stocks for hours or even days. They couldn't move, couldn't shield themselves from weather or insults, and often couldn't avoid the occasional dog urinating on them. It wasn't designed to kill, it was designed to embarrass. Then there was the pillory, a close cousin of the stocks. This device clamped a person's head and hands upright, forcing them to stand, bent slightly forward, while the public did what it did best, judge loudly. Crimes punished by pillory could include cheating customers, lying in court, or making false accusations. For more serious offenses, punishment escalated. Whipping was common, sometimes in public, sometimes as part of a procession through the town. The number of lashes might be symbolic, or completely arbitrary, depending on the mood of the judge. In towns, branding was used to mark repeat offenders. A thief might have a T burned into their hand or forehead. Counterfeiters might receive an F for falsifier. These weren't just scars, they were permanent resumes of shame, visible every time the person tried to work or buy bread. And then there was mutilation. A thief might lose a hand. A liar, a tongue. Adulterers could be disfigured. Ears were popular targets for removal, especially for repeat offenders. After all, you only had two. Eyes, too, weren't off the table. The idea was clear: make the punishment unforgettable, and make the criminal an object lesson. Of course, execution was always an option, though it was more common for serious or repeat crimes. Hanging was the standard, quick, sometimes cheap, and highly visible. For nobility, beheading was considered more honorable, though that depended on the skill of the executioner. There are plenty of stories of botched jobs. Some executions were designed to make a point. Drawing and quartering, for example, was reserved for high treason and involved multiple steps of agony. Burning at the stake was used especially for heresy, witchcraft, or crimes against the church. It was painful, yes, but also theatrical. The gallows were public, placed on hills or crossroads. Sometimes bodies were left to hang for days, even weeks, as a warning to others. In some cases, the heads of traitors were impaled on spikes above city gates. London Bridge was infamous for this. But punishments weren't always violent. Sometimes the goal was to financially cripple or isolate the criminal. Fines could be enormous, especially for peasants, and failing to pay might lead to imprisonment or forfeiture of property. The medieval jail, by the way, was not a punishment in itself. It was a holding place while you awaited trial or punishment. Jails were overcrowded, filthy, and full of disease. They were privately run, often by someone who charged inmates rent for their cell, food, or even chains. Being poor in jail meant starving. Yet, despite all this brutality, most medieval punishments had a clear logic: don't let the offender vanish from view. Shame, exposure, and suffering were the tools of justice. Because if one villager saw another pelted with cabbages in the stocks, maybe, just maybe, they'd think twice before stealing a loaf of bread. And if they didn't, well, there were always more cabbages. Not all crimes in medieval Europe involved stealing bread or stabbing a rival in a tavern. Some of the most terrifying accusations were about what you thought, not what you did. In a world where the church defined morality, deviation from religious orthodoxy wasn't just dangerous to your soul, it was dangerous to society. And the punishment could be as spiritual as it was brutal. Let's begin with heresy, a word that, in medieval times, could mean almost anything that contradicted the teachings of the Church. Believing the wrong thing about the Trinity, criticizing the Pope, reading the Bible in the wrong language, or even just preaching without permission could label you a heretic. The Church was deeply afraid of heresy not only because it challenged spiritual authority, but because it threatened to unravel the delicate social fabric. In a time when religion explained everything, from illness to politics, questioning doctrine felt like lighting a match near a dry thatched roof. At first, the Church tried to deal with heretics through debate. But eventually, fear took over. And with fear came the Inquisition. The medieval Inquisition wasn't quite the nightmare it's sometimes portrayed as, but it was still a powerful, secretive arm of church justice. It began in the 12th century, mostly to root out heretical movements like the Cathars in southern France. Accused heretics were summoned, interrogated, and often kept in prison for months while their cases were investigated. The process favored confession, and confession often followed pressure, threats, or torture. Those who confessed might be forgiven. Those who refused could be burned. Witchcraft, too, evolved from superstition into persecution. In the early medieval period, the Church officially dismissed belief in witches as pagan nonsense. But as fear of heresy grew, that changed. By the late Middle Ages, especially in the 15th century, witches were seen not just as local healers or village outcasts, but as servants of the devil. Trials for witchcraft exploded, especially in rural areas. Accusations often started with strange events: a cow died, a child fell ill, a storm ruined a harvest. People wanted an explanation. Often, they found it in someone nearby, usually a woman, usually poor, and usually disliked. The logic of witch trials was circular. If the accused denied the charge, it meant they were lying, which witches do. If they confessed, they were guilty. Some were subjected to swimming tests, where they were bound and thrown into water, a variation on the earlier ordeal by water. If they floated, guilty. If they sank, innocent, and possibly drowned. Confessions were often extracted through pain. Torture was allowed in many territories, especially when dealing with matters of the soul. Victims were stretched on racks, pressed with weights, or pierced with needles. Eventually, many would say whatever their accusers wanted, including fantastic stories of flying on broomsticks or making pacts with demons. Once condemned, the punishment was usually death. Burning at the stake was common, partly because it symbolized purging by fire, and partly because it left nothing behind to bury. But not all crimes of belief were so extreme. People could be punished for blasphemy, speaking irreverently about God, or for sorcery, which was seen as using supernatural powers for selfish ends. Even astrology, alchemy, or fortune-telling could be dangerous in the wrong context. And then there were the moral panics, sudden waves of fear where entire communities turned on one another. Rumors of satanic cults, child sacrifice, or mass poisoning could lead to dozens of arrests and executions, all based on nothing but fear and hearsay. What made these crimes so chilling was that they weren't about what people had done, but what people believed, or what others thought they believed. Guilt was invisible, evidence was emotional, and justice was often irreversible. In the end, crimes of belief weren't about crime at all. They were about control. Control of minds, of communities, of power. And in medieval Europe, power was deeply afraid of anything it didn't understand. When we think of prison today, we imagine long sentences, iron bars, state-issued clothing, and a diet of government-approved meals. But in medieval Europe, prison wasn't typically where your punishment happened, it was where you waited for it. And while you waited, you paid. In more ways than one. To begin with, medieval jails weren't built to hold people long term. Sentences of 5 years in prison were rare. Instead, people were jailed while awaiting trial, waiting for a fine to be paid, or sometimes waiting for their family to buy their freedom. The system wasn't meant to rehabilitate or even punish, it was simply about containment, debt, and discomfort. And yes, you had to pay for the privilege. Prisons were often run privately. A local sheriff, lord, or gaoler had control of the jail, and he charged inmates for everything. Want food? Pay. Want a blanket? Pay. Want to not be chained to the wall? That'll cost extra. Couldn't pay? Well, you could starve, freeze, or sit in your own waste, assuming you weren't sharing a cell with 5 others doing the same. Cells were cold, damp, and unsanitary. Drainage was poor or non-existent. Disease ran rampant. Inmates often had to bring their own bedding, or lie on straw that hadn't been changed in weeks. Lice, fleas, rats, and infection were common. Light and ventilation were rare. And yet, prison wasn't always solitary misery. If you had money or influence, you might receive preferential treatment. Wealthy prisoners could buy larger cells, better food, even visitors or musicians to keep them company. In some cases, a well-connected prisoner might be permitted to leave the prison during the day, returning only at night, a medieval version of house arrest. Still, prison was deeply class-based. The poor, who couldn't bribe or pay for decent conditions, suffered most. Some were chained to walls or floors. Some were kept in little-eased cells, deliberately built too small to stand up or lie down fully. Designed to exhaust body and mind, these were torture chambers in all but name. Then there were the debtors' prisons, where people who owed money could be locked up indefinitely. Ironically, this made it impossible for them to work to repay what they owed. Families often had to beg, borrow, or sell possessions to get their relatives out. Prisons were also used for political leverage. Hostages, rival claimants to thrones, or troublesome lords might be kept in castles or monasteries, with varying degrees of comfort. Some were treated like honored guests. Others rotted in dungeons for years. Punishment in prison was often informal. Guards might beat prisoners or extort them for better conditions. Occasionally, prisoners were tortured to extract confessions, even though this was technically illegal without proper authorization. The idea of a fair and humane prison was still centuries away. Still, prison could be temporary mercy. Instead of hanging or mutilation, a short stint in jail, combined with a fine or public apology, was sometimes seen as sufficient punishment. But short was relative. If you couldn't pay your way out, a few days could turn into months. And yes, some people escaped. Security was often lax, and bribery worked wonders. Tunnels, ropes, and sympathetic guards could all play a role. Some jails were so disorganized that prisoners simply walked out. In time, public opinion began to shift. Reformers would emerge, calling for more humane treatment, especially of debtors and the falsely accused. But that wouldn't happen until much later. In the medieval period, prison wasn't about justice. It was a miserable limbo, a place where suffering had a price tag, and only the lucky or wealthy could buy their way free. And the rest? Well, they waited. In the cold. In the dark. Listening for footsteps. If you've ever dreamed of living in the past, this may cure you. In this unusually long, admittedly boring, but painfully accurate tour through crime and punishment in medieval Europe, we won't be chasing knights or listening to grand speeches from kings. Instead, we'll be dragging our feet through the muddy streets of a stinking medieval town, avoiding pickpockets, public hangings, and the occasional rat-infested jail. This is not a story of glorious conquests or shiny armor. This is the history of the people who got caught. The petty thieves, the loud drunks, the bakers who cheated customers by using bad grain. It's about crimes so small we'd barely notice them today, and punishments so brutal they'd make a modern audience queasy. Our journey will take us through village courts and royal tribunals, dungeons and scaffolds. We'll meet corrupt sheriffs, bumbling watchmen, terrified peasants, and the very unlucky souls who found themselves at the wrong end of the law. And we'll do it all in a tone calm enough to lull you to sleep, assuming the details of hot tongs and stocks don't wake you right back up. Get comfortable. Light a candle. Maybe lock your door. You're about to hear just how bad it was to get caught stealing a chicken in 1297. The legal definition of crime in the medieval period was remarkably flexible. It depended on where you lived, who ruled over you, and sometimes who you offended. There were no standardized penal codes like today. Instead, crimes were defined by custom, religious teaching, and local tradition. It wasn't just theft or murder. Cursing, working on a Sunday, refusing to kneel at Mass, or gossiping too loudly could get you into serious trouble. Most crimes were divided into three broad categories: crimes against the church, heresy, blasphemy, missing Mass, witchcraft, eventually, or simply disagreeing too loudly with a priest. These were often punished with spiritual penalties, but not always. A heretic could end up at the stake. Crimes against the crown, treason, rebellion, counterfeiting coins, and sometimes poaching royal deer. These were serious and often carried the death penalty, or worse, mutilation. Crimes against your neighbors, theft, assault, murder, adultery, slander, and general bad behavior. These were the most common. Some acts were considered sins and therefore crimes. Others were treated more like disruptions to social harmony. For example, a woman shouting at her husband in public might be punished for disturbing the peace. A man refusing to pay a debt might be put in the stocks. In one case, a pig was put on trial for eating a child. Really? And yes, animals could be criminals. Sometimes even executed. But we'll get to that. Next, we'll look at how justice was enforced in places where literacy was rare, superstition ruled, and trials didn't always require evidence. Medieval law enforcement was, in a word, inconsistent. In another word, local. There was no national police force, no central authority issuing badges or uniforms. Instead, justice was maintained by an odd patchwork of officials, volunteers, and people who just liked knowing everyone's business. In towns, a watchman might be employed to patrol the streets at night, calling out the hour and watching for fires or troublemakers. These men weren't exactly professionals. Often, the job was given to older men, or those who weren't fit for physical labor. In some places, the role rotated among citizens as a civic duty, whether they wanted it or not. The day-to-day enforcer of the law was usually the constable, a locally appointed official tasked with keeping the peace. The constable could arrest people, organize a posse, or drag a suspect before a local court. But their powers varied widely depending on the region and century. In the countryside, things were even more informal. Law and order often relied on what was called tithing, a group of 10 men who were collectively responsible for each other's behavior. If one committed a crime, the others were expected to produce him or face punishment themselves. It was a crude form of communal policing. And then there were the manorial courts, overseen by the local lord or his steward. Villagers would gather periodically to settle minor disputes and deal with small offenses. Gossiping, petty theft, livestock straying into someone else's field, all might be punished with a fine or a few hours in the stocks. Perhaps the most underrated force in medieval law enforcement was the village itself. Reputation mattered. And the village gossips, who always knew who was sleeping with whom, who owed what, and who was stealing bread, could make or break someone's life. Social pressure could be as punishing as any legal penalty. In many ways, the enforcement of law was more about managing order than punishing wrongdoing. Justice was often arbitrary, depending on the mood of the lord, the testimony of neighbors, or the size of the bribe. But once someone was accused, what came next? Trials of a sort. Once accused of a crime in medieval Europe, you were not exactly presumed innocent. The idea of a fair and balanced legal system was a luxury for future generations. In many cases, especially in early medieval periods, trials involved divine intervention. The belief was simple: God would not let an innocent person suffer unjustly. This led to the infamous trials by ordeal. Trial by fire involved tasks like holding a red-hot iron bar or walking several paces with it in hand. Your hand would then be bandaged and examined after a few days. If the wound was healing cleanly, you were innocent. If it was festering, well, clearly you had sinned. Trial by water had several variations. One of the most popular involved binding the accused and tossing them into a pond or river. If they sank, they were innocent, though potentially drowned. If they floated, they were guilty, because water, as a pure element, rejected them. Trial by combat was another option, mostly for nobles. Two parties would fight, often to the death, under the belief that God would grant victory to the righteous. For commoners, there were sometimes champions who could fight in your place, assuming you could afford one. By the High Middle Ages, these barbaric methods began to fade, replaced by trial by jury in England and similar systems elsewhere. But even jury trials were far from modern standards. Juries were made up of locals who probably knew the accused, the accuser, and all their relatives. They didn't need evidence. Gossip and character often weighed more heavily than facts. Another path was compurgation, or oath-taking. A defendant would swear they were innocent, and then find a number of people, sometimes 12, who would swear to believe them. This wasn't about evidence, it was about community standing. If you were popular, this worked. If not, good luck. Confession, too, was highly valued. Unfortunately, confessions could be, and often were, extracted under duress. Torture wasn't uncommon, especially in ecclesiastical courts or under inquisitorial systems. Sometimes, the mere act of being accused was enough to ruin your life. Trials could take months, and if you were held in jail, conditions were horrific. Food often had to be provided by family or friends. Jails weren't punishment, they were holding pens until punishment. In this chaotic system, the rich had a better chance than the poor. They could bribe officials, hire better oath helpers, and avoid torture. For peasants, justice was a gamble, and the house rarely lost. If medieval justice had a personality, it would be grim, theatrical, and absolutely convinced of its own righteousness. In a world where many could not read, and where fear was often the best motivator, punishments were designed to be public, painful, and unforgettable. The goal wasn't just to correct the wronged, it was to terrify everyone else into obedience. Let's step into the brutal world of medieval punishment, where justice was often loud, bloody, and very personal. Despite what films suggest, not every accused criminal in medieval Europe was tortured. But when torture was used, it was brutal and often state-sanctioned, especially in cases involving heresy, treason, or refusal to confess. Torture was believed to be a way to extract the truth, which sounds absurd today but made twisted sense in a world where confession was king. No confession? Clearly, you were still hiding guilt. Some common methods included the rack, a wooden frame where the victim's wrists and ankles were tied to rollers. Turning the rollers stretched the body until joints dislocated, muscles tore, and bones cracked. Thumb screws, a simple device that crushed fingers or toes between metal bars. Effective, portable, and terrifying. Strapado, the victim's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted up by a rope, then dropped suddenly, dislocating the shoulders. Repeat as needed. The iron boot, a metal casing placed around the leg. Wooden wedges were hammered in until the leg was crushed. The Church, particularly the Inquisition, also made use of torture, sometimes with grim creativity. But they were careful, too. Torture was only officially allowed under certain conditions, and they were supposed to stop short of causing death. Of course, those rules were loosely enforced. Execution was more than punishment, it was theater. Public hangings, beheadings, and burnings drew huge crowds. For many, it was the only live entertainment available. Common methods of execution included hanging, the most typical method, especially for thieves. Early hangings often didn't break the neck instantly, leaving the condemned to strangle slowly. Beheading, reserved for nobles or those guilty of high treason. A quick death, in theory. In reality, it often took multiple swings, depending on the skill of the executioner. Burning at the stake, used for heresy and witchcraft. Meant to purify the soul by fire. Victims were tied to a post and set alight, sometimes with mercy shown by strangling them first. Drowning, a method used against women accused of infanticide or witches. It could be a test: if you float, you're guilty; if you sink, you're innocent but dead. Breaking on the wheel, the ultimate punishment for serious crimes. The victim was tied to a large wheel and had their limbs smashed with a hammer. Then the broken body was left to die slowly, often over days. Sometimes, executions included extra humiliation. Heads might be displayed on spikes, bodies left hanging as warnings, or even quartered and sent to different parts of the kingdom. It's hard to overstate how important public punishment was. Most towns didn't have prisons as we know them. Instead of locking someone away for years, the idea was to make them suffer publicly, pay a fine, or be executed, and move on. This meant punishments had to make a statement. Stocks and pillories, wooden frames that held the victim's head and hands, or just their feet. Set in the center of town. People would mock, throw garbage, or worse. Sometimes the humiliation was worse than the crime. Flogging, public whipping, often tied to a post. Done in the market square. The number of lashes varied by offense, as did the type of whip used. Branding, using hot irons to mark criminals for life. A thief might get a teeth on the hand, a blasphemer a different symbol. Branding turned the body into a walking record of past sins. Mutilation, cutting off ears, noses, hands, or even tongues. Done both as punishment and warning. Punishment wasn't always cruel. Some crimes, especially first offenses, resulted in fines or penance. But for repeat offenders or those who angered the powerful, the full force of medieval justice was terrifying. To modern eyes, medieval punishment looks like barbaric cruelty. But at the time, it made sense. Society was fragile. Fear kept people in line. And making examples out of the unlucky few was cheaper than running prisons. It was also deeply personal. Justice wasn't cold and bureaucratic. It was visible, emotional, and often tied to religious ideas of sin and redemption. Still, for the people who lived it, or died by it, medieval punishment was not symbolic. It was painfully real. If you imagine a medieval prison as a cold stone dungeon with straw on the floor and a few skeletons chained to the walls, congratulations, you're only slightly exaggerating. But it's important to note that the concept of prison as punishment is surprisingly modern. In the medieval world, prisons were not where you served your sentence. They were where you waited for it. Most medieval prisoners were not doing time for a crime. They were being held until something happened. A trial, the payment of a fine, the delivery of a ransom, or, in some cases, execution. A prison was a holding pen. It was a place of suspense, not punishment, though it certainly felt punishing. There were several types of places used as prisons. The most famous, of course, were castles with their underground dungeons. These were often damp, unlit chambers with minimal air circulation and no toilet facilities. If you were lucky, you might get a wooden bucket. If you were really lucky, you might not have to share it. In towns and cities, jails were often attached to other buildings, like town halls or sheriff's residences. Some were simply rooms in the local gatehouse or tower. Others were little more than makeshift holding cells. And there were different classes of prisoners. Wealthier inmates might be kept in more comfortable conditions, sometimes even allowed visitors, bedding, and food from outside, so long as they could pay. Paying was key. Many prisons operated on a kind of grim pay-to-survive basis. Prisoners were expected to pay the jailer for their upkeep. No money? No food. Or worse, you might be shackled, not for security, but as punishment for being poor. Some jailers even charged fees just for removing your chains. And then there was the debtor's prison, an institution that really gained popularity in the later medieval and early modern periods. Here, people who owed money could be imprisoned until their families or friends paid off the debt. This created a delightful catch-22. You couldn't earn money while imprisoned, but you couldn't be released until money was paid. Some inmates spent years behind bars for owing a few shillings. Conditions were universally grim. Disease ran rampant. Insects thrived. Rats were your constant companions. There was little to do except pray, beg for release, or contemplate your life choices while listening to the moans of fellow prisoners. Torture might be reserved for specific interrogations, but just being in prison was suffering enough. Strangely, despite all this, jail time was not typically considered a punishment in itself. Medieval punishments were usually swift, fines, public shaming, flogging, or death. The notion that someone should be locked away for years as a way to reform them would have seemed odd, if not wasteful. Prisons were for containment, not rehabilitation. It wasn't until the end of the medieval period that jails began to evolve into something closer to what we'd recognize today. The rise of more centralized governments and codified legal systems led to a slow shift in thinking. Maybe locking people up was a way to both punish and remove troublemakers from society without killing them. But that change came slowly. For most of the Middle Ages, if you heard the clang of a cell door behind you, it didn't mean you were being punished. It meant you were in limbo, suspended between judgment and fate. And that fate? It could be anything. Which leads us to our final chapter. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've wandered through the muddy streets, stared up at the gallows, peeked inside a dungeon, and survived the long, drafty corridors of medieval justice. Now, as the metaphorical torchlight flickers low, we ask, what was the point of all this? Beyond curiosity and cobwebs, does this strange, brutal system still matter? Surprisingly, yes. In more ways than we might like to admit, the long-dead practices of medieval law still cast shadows over our modern systems. The courtroom rituals. The obsession with confessions. The public spectacle of justice. Even the very idea of a prison sentence. All of these have roots, tangled, dirty roots, in the practices of our medieval ancestors. Take the common law system, for instance. Originating in medieval England, it's still the foundation of legal systems in the UK, the US, Canada, and many other countries. The idea that past decisions, precedents, guide current rulings. That began when medieval judges started recording decisions so future courts would handle similar cases the same way. Before that, justice was more like a raffle, inconsistent, arbitrary, and largely dependent on the mood of your local lord. Then there's trial by jury, which, while far from perfect in medieval times, think 12 angry illiterate farmers, laid the groundwork for the modern right to be judged by a group of peers. Even the concept of legal representation, once a privilege only for the powerful, began to trickle downward from the courts of kings to those of commoners. Some medieval ideas aged poorly, of course. The practice of torture as a method of interrogation persisted into early modernity and still haunts debates around ethics and legality. Public punishments, stocks, whippings, executions, evolved into something subtler but no less theatrical. Today, courtrooms remain public, news cameras swarm high-profile trials, and the idea of justice being seen to be done still dominates our perception of fairness. We also inherited less visible legacies. The fear of social disorder, so central to medieval law, is still reflected in modern laws aimed at maintaining public decency or peace. The suspicion of the outsider, the harsh treatment of dissenters, and even the link between morality and legality, all echo the instincts of medieval lawmakers. Prisons, once places of limbo, have now become our primary form of punishment. But many remain overcrowded, unsanitary, and plagued by inequality, not so different from the dungeons of old. And just like in the past, money still buys better treatment. Bail, access to good legal counsel, clean conditions, these often depend more on your bank account than your crime. Medieval justice also taught us something uncomfortable about power. The law, supposedly blind, was almost always tilted in favor of the rich and powerful. Lords, clergy, royalty, they got away with a lot. Peasants did not. Today, we tell ourselves things are different. Sometimes they are. Often, they're not. And yet, out of this brutal, chaotic mess came progress. Slowly, painfully, people began demanding fairer laws, more humane treatment, and systems of accountability. What began in fire and blood evolved, at glacial speed, into something resembling justice. Not perfect. Not pure. But better than before. In a strange way, the medieval world reminds us of how far we've come, and how fragile those gains can be. It's a mirror we might not enjoy looking into, but one we should glance at from time to time. So the next time you grumble about jury duty or roll your eyes at courtroom dramas, remember the alternative: a cold stone floor, a suspicious monk with a whip, and a pig standing trial for murder. History is ugly. Justice is messier still. But understanding where we came from? That's the only way to stop ourselves from wandering backward.